The doors of Sterling and Hayes Luxury Emporium opened with a whisper so soft it could have been mistaken for a breath. But to Marcus Williams, standing on the threshold, with his 8-year-old son's hand clasped tightly in his own, that whisper felt like thunder. It felt like judgment. It felt like every door that had ever closed in his face, every opportunity denied, every promise broken by a world that looked at him and saw only what it wanted to see. 45 years of life had carved lines into Marcus's face, lines born not from laughter, but from labor, from sleepless nights spent wondering how he would feed his son, from the weight of being both mother and father to a boy who had already lost too much. Isaiah. That was his son's name. 8 years old today. 8 years of fighting to survive in a world that seemed designed to crush people like them. 8 years since the day Marcus held that tiny body in the hospital and made a promise to his dying wife that he would give their son everything, even when he had nothing. Today, Marcus wore his only clean shirt, the one he saved for moments that mattered, though the collar was frayed and the fabric had faded from navy to something closer to gray. His jeans were worn thin at their knees, not from fashion, but from kneeling, from praying, from scrubbing floors in the warehouse where he worked double shifts loading boxes that weighed more than his son. His shoes, old leather that had seen better years, carried him forward across marble floors so pristine they reflected the chandeliers hanging overhead like frozen stars. The store smelled of wealth, that particular scent of leather and perfume, and something else Marcus could not name, something that seemed to say, "You do not belong here, you never will." Isaiah wore his best clothes too, a shirt 2 sizes too large that had belonged to a neighbor's child, pants that were just slightly too short, shoes that did not quite match but were clean, so clean, because Marcus had spent an hour last night scrubbing them until his hands ached. But Isaiah's smile, oh, that smile, was worth every moment of pain, every sacrifice, every humiliation Marcus had endured. Because today was special. Today, Marcus was going to give his son something he had saved 6 months to afford, skipping meals, walking to work instead of taking the bus, counting every single dollar with hands that trembled from exhaustion and hope. The glass cases stretched before them like displays in a museum, filled with watches that cost more than Marcus made in a year, bracelets that glittered under lights too bright, necklaces that seemed to whisper of lives Marcus would never touch, worlds he would never enter. But there, in the corner case, was the same reason they had come. A silver chain with a lion pendant, small but beautifully crafted, its mane detailed with such care that even from a distance you could see the artistry. Isaiah had seen it 3 months ago when they were walking past the store. His nose pressed against the window, his eyes wide with wonder, and he had said, "Daddy, that's you." That lion, strong and brave. And Marcus, who had not felt strong or brave in longer than he could remember, had felt something crack open in his chest. He had called the store the next day, explained that he was saving money, asked if they could hold it. The voice on the phone had been professional, polite even, saying, "Of course, sir, we understand, take your time." But now, standing inside the town store with his son's small, warm hand in his, Marcus felt the temperature change. It was subtle at first, the way a woman behind the counter looked up from helping another customer, her smile evaporating the moment her eyes landed on Marcus and Isaiah. Not slowly, not gradually, But instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch, another employee, a young man in a suit so perfectly pressed, it looked like it had never been worn before, turned from arranging watches in a display case. His gaze traveled from Marcus's worn shoes, up his faded jeans, to his frayed collar, and something flickered across his face. Not quite disgust, not quite fear, but something in between, something that made Marcus's stomach tighten, because he had seen that look before, 1,000 times before, in grocery stores and banks and school offices and everywhere else he dared to exist in spaces the world had decided were not meant for him. Isaiah did not notice. He was staring at the pendant, his breath fogging the glass case, his finger pointing. "Daddy, there it is. Can we get it now? Please." His voice was pure joy, pure innocence, and Marcus wanted to bottle that sound, to preserve it forever, because he knew how quickly the world could steal that innocence away. "Yes," Marcus said softly, squeezing his son's hand. "Yes, we can." He straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and walked toward the counter. The woman there, blonde hair pulled back so tightly, it seemed to stretch her face, crossed her arms. The young man moved closer, positioning himself between Marcus and the display cases, as if guarding treasure from a thief. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "I called a few weeks ago about the lion pendant in the corner case. I told someone I was saving up for it. I'm ready to purchase it today." The woman's eyes narrowed. She glanced at the young man, then back at Marcus. "That piece is quite expensive," she said slowly, enunciating each word as if speaking to someone who might not understand English. "I'm aware," Marcus replied. "I have the money." He reached into his jacket pocket, feeling the envelope there, the one he had counted and recounted so many times. The paper was soft as fabric. Inside were bills he had earned with sweat and pain and sacrifice, every dollar a piece of himself, given over to this moment. The woman did not reach for the envelope. She did not move toward the case. Instead she said, "Sir, perhaps you would be more comfortable at one of our other locations. We have stores that carry more affordable items." Her tone was not unkind, but it was final, dismissive, as if she had already decided that Marcus was not worthy of shopping here, not capable of affording anything in this space designed for people who lived in a different world. Marcus felt heat rising in his face, the familiar burn of shame mixing with anger. "I don't want to go to another location," he said, keeping his voice level. "I want to buy the pendant here, the one your colleague told me you would hold." The young man stepped forward now, his hand moving to the radio clipped to his belt. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave," he said, his voice low but firm. "We don't allow solicitation in this store." "Solicitation?" Marcus repeated, the word hanging in the air like smoke. "I'm not soliciting. I'm a customer." The young man's jaw tightened. His fingers hovered near the radio. "Sir, if you don't leave now, I will call security." Isaiah's hand squeezed Marcus's fingers so hard it hurt. "Daddy," the boy whispered, his voice suddenly small, suddenly afraid. "Why is he saying that? What did we do wrong?" And in that moment, standing in a store filled with beautiful things, surrounded by other customers who had stopped shopping to watch, their faces a mixture of discomfort and curiosity, and something that looked like pity, Marcus felt something inside him begin to break. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly, the way a heart breaks when it has broken so many times before that it no longer makes sound. He looked down at his son, at the confusion in those wide brown eyes, at the fear creeping in where joy had been just moments before, and he wanted to rage. He wanted to shout that he had money, that he had worked himself sick for this moment, that his skin color and his worn clothes did not make him less human, less worthy, less deserving of respect. But he did not shout, because Isaiah was watching. Because more than anything, Marcus wanted his son to see strength, not bitterness, to learn grace, not hatred, to understand that dignity was not something others could take from you. It was something you carried inside yourself, even when the world tried to strip it away. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to tell his son they would leave, that they would find another store, another pendant, another way. But before the words could form, another voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. What exactly is happening here? The voice was calm, measured, but it carried a weight that made every person in the store freeze. The woman behind the counter straightened. The young man's hand dropped from his radio. Other customers turned, and Marcus, still holding his son's hand, looked toward the source of the voice and saw a man who seemed to command the space simply by existing in it. He was older, perhaps in his mid-60s, with silver hair and a suit that looked like it cost more than Marcus's car, if Marcus had owned a car. His eyes were dark and sharp, taking in the scene with the kind of attention that missed nothing. He walked forward slowly, each step deliberate, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less powerful. I asked a question. What is happening here? The young employee cleared his throat. We were handling a situation, Mr. Hayes, he said, and Marcus felt his breath catch because he knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. Richard Hayes, the owner. The man whose family had built this empire, whose wealth was so vast it was spoken of in whispers, whose power opened doors and silenced objections. Richard Hayes looked at the young man, then at the woman behind the counter, then at Marcus and Isaiah. His expression was unreadable. A situation, he repeated slowly. And what situation would that be exactly? The woman spoke up, her voice defensive. This man came in, and we were concerned about his intentions. We thought it best to protect the store and our merchandise. Protect the store, Richard Hayes echoed. He turned to Marcus, and his gaze was different now. Not cold, but curious, perhaps even kind. Sir, he said, his tone shifting, becoming gentler. What were your intentions? Marcus hesitated. He felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him, felt the familiar pressure of being forced to justify his existence, his presence, his right to occupy space in a world that had never wanted him. But something in Richard Hayes's eyes, something that looked like genuine interest rather than suspicion, made him speak. I came to buy a gift for my son, Marcus said quietly. It's his birthday today. I called ahead weeks ago. I've been saving money. I have it with me. He held up the now envelope, his hand trembling slightly. Richard Hayes looked at the envelope, then at Isaiah, who was still gripping his father's hand, his eyes wide and frightened. The older man's expression softened in a way that seemed to transform his entire face. He nodded slowly. I see, he said. And my employees decided you were a threat. Is that correct? Marcus did not answer, but his silence was answer enough. Richard Hayes turned back to the two employees, and when he spoke, his voice was ice, sharp and cutting. In my store, he said, each word falling like a stone, we treat every person who walks through that door with respect. Every single person. I do not care what they wear. I do not care where they come from. I do not care about anything, except that they are a human being who has chosen to enter this establishment, which makes them a guest, and we treat guests with dignity. Do you understand? The young man's face had gone pale. Mr. Hayes, I thought. Richard raised a hand, cutting him off. You thought what? That, because this man's shoes are worn, he cannot afford to shop here. That because his clothes are not new, he must be dangerous? That because he brought his son into this store on the boy's birthday, he is somehow unworthy of being served. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single person in the store moved or spoke. Other customers watched with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction, as if they had been waiting for someone to say what they all knew, but had been too comfortable to acknowledge. Richard Hayes walked over to the corner case, his movements deliberate and slow. He unlocked it himself, reaching in with careful hands, and lifted the silver chain with the lion pendant. He held it up to the light, the metal gleaming, the craftsmanship evident even from a distance. This is what you came for? He asked Marcus. Yes, sir, Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard walked over and stood in front of Isaiah. He knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's level, and placed the pendant in the child's small hand. Isaiah stared at it, then at his father, then at the stranger who had just given him the thing he wanted most in the world. Happy birthday, Richard said gently. Marcus's throat closed. I have the money, he managed to say, holding out the envelope. I didn't come here for charity. I came to buy this with my own money, with dignity. Richard Hayes looked at Marcus for a long moment, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words, beyond circumstances, beyond the walls that society built between people. You're right, Richard said finally. Forgive me. He took the envelope, opened it, and counted out the exact price of the pendant. He handed the rest of the bills back to Marcus, then retrieved a velvet box from behind the counter and placed the pendant inside it carefully before giving it to Isaiah. The boy held it like it was made of light rather than silver. But Richard Hayes was not finished. He turned back to the two employees who had tried to force Marcus and his son to leave. You're both fired, he said simply, and the words hung in the air like a verdict. The woman gasped. The young man's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Mr. Hayes, please, the woman began, but Richard cut her off. Your job is to serve people, to welcome them, to treat them with the respect every human being deserves. You failed. Collect your things and leave. The two employees stood, frozen, their faces reflecting shock and shame, and something that might have been the first stirrings of understanding, though it came too late. They turned slowly and walked toward the back of the store, watched by everyone present. Richard turned back to Marcus and Isaiah. I meant what I said earlier, he told Marcus. I'm sorry. This should never have happened. Not in my store. Not anywhere. Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. Richard knelt again in front of it. Isaiah. Do you know what a lion represents? He asked the boy. Isaiah shook his head. A lion is the protector, Richard said. He's strong and brave. He fights for his family. He stands tall, even when the world tries to bring him down. Your father, he said, glancing up at Marcus, is a lion. And don't you ever forget that. Isaiah's eyes filled with tears. He nodded, clutching the velvet box to his chest. Richard stood and extended his hand to Marcus. Marcus took it, and the handshake was firm. Equal, a gesture between two men rather than between wealth and poverty, power and powerlessness. Then Richard Hayes said something that Marcus would carry in his heart for the rest of his life. The worth of a man is not in his wallet or his clothes. It's in his character, in the love he gives, in the sacrifices he makes. And you, sir, are one of the wealthiest men I've ever met. As Marcus and Isaiah walked out of the store, the velvet box held carefully in the boy's hands, neither of them could know that the story was far from over. Behind them, Richard Hayes stood watching them disappear into the crowd outside, his mind turning with thoughts that had been dormant for years, memories and regrets that this encounter had awakened. Richard Hayes had not always been the man standing in that store today. There was a time, decades ago, when he had been young and idealistic, when he believed that wealth should be used for good, that privilege carried responsibility, that the measure of life was not in what you accumulated, but in what you gave. He had fallen in love with a woman named Lorraine. She worked in a diner, wore second-hand clothes, lived in a neighborhood his family would never visit. But she had a smile that could light up the darkest room and a heart so full of compassion it seemed impossible that one person could contain so much love. Richard's family had been horrified. They told him she was beneath him, that she would ruin his reputation. That love was not enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. And Richard, young and afraid of being cut off from his inheritance, from everything he had known, had made the worst decision of his life. He walked away from Lorraine. He married someone his family approved of, someone with the right pedigree and connections. And he spent the next 40 years building an empire while wondering what his life might have been if he had chosen love over legacy. Lorraine died 5 years ago. Richard learned about it through an old friend who thought he should know. She never married. She worked until her body gave out. When she passed, there was no grand funeral, just a small gathering of people who remembered her kindness. Richard went, standing in the back where no one would recognize him, and he wept for the man he had been, for the coward who valued money over meaning, for all the years they could have had together. Seeing Marcus today, watching a man with nothing fight to give his son everything, Richard saw what he himself had lost. He saw what real wealth looked like. It was not in the marble floors or the chandeliers or the expensive merchandise. It was in the grip of a father's hand around his sons, in the sacrifice of skipped meals and double shifts, in the determination to create one moment of joy despite a world designed to crush that joy. But there was more to this story, threads connecting Marcus and Richard in ways neither of them yet understood. Years earlier, when Isaiah was still a baby and Marcus's wife was alive, she had worked as a cleaning woman. Her name was Diane. She scrubbed floors in office buildings after everyone else had gone home, invisible to the people who walked those halls during the day, her labor unacknowledged, her humanity unseen. One of those buildings belonged to the Hayes Corporation. One night, late, when the offices were empty and the city outside was dark, Diane found a young man slumped in a stairwell. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, his skin clammy and pale. She could have walked past. She could have called security and let them handle it. She had another building to clean that night, and she was already running late, and every minute mattered when you were paid by the job rather than by the hour. But Diane was not the kind of woman who could walk past someone in pain. She knelt beside him, checked his pulse, spoke to him in a soft voice trying to keep him conscious. She called an ambulance, and she stayed with him holding his hand, telling him he was going to be okay, even though she did not know if that was true. She stayed until the paramedics arrived, until they loaded him into the ambulance, until she was sure he would not be alone. It made her late for her next job. It cost her money she could not afford to lose. But when she came home that night and Marcus asked why she was so late, she just said there was extra work. She never mentioned saving a stranger's life, because to her it was not heroic. It was simply human. That young man in the stairwell was Daniel Hayes, Richard's son. He had been struggling with addiction for years, spiraling downward into a darkness that no amount of money or privilege could pull him out of. That night, he had overdosed, and if Diane had not found him, if she had not stayed with him, if she had chosen convenience over compassion, he would have died alone in that stairwell. The ambulance saved his life medically, but Diane's kindness saved something deeper. Daniel went to rehab after that. He got clean. He rebuilt his life, piece by piece. And though he never learned the name of the woman who held his hand and refused to leave him alone in his darkest moment, he never forgot her face. He told his father about her once, years later, after he had been sober for a while. He said she had the kindest eyes he had ever seen, that she spoke to him like he mattered even when he felt like he did not matter at all. Richard had listened to his son's story and felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. But he never knew who she was. He never had the chance to thank her. Until today, when Richard saw Isaiah's eyes, something in his memory stirred. They were the same eyes Daniel had described, warm and deep and somehow familiar. And when Marcus mentioned his wife had passed away 2 years ago, Richard felt a cold certainty settle into his bones. That evening, after the store closed, Richard made a phone call to someone who could access records, who could trace employment histories. Within hours he had confirmation. Diane Williams, cleaning staff at Hayes Corporation, building from 2012 to 2018, died of cancer 2 years ago, left behind a husband and son, the woman who saved Daniel's life, and Marcus, the man who had been humiliated in his store today, was her husband, the father of her child. Richard sat alone in his office that night, the city lights glowing outside his window, and felt the weight of it all. The cruelty of the world that had judged Marcus, the kindness of Diane who had expected nothing in return for saving a life, the way that single act of compassion had rippled forward through time, connecting their families in ways neither could have predicted. He thought about Lorraine and the life he had not lived, about the choices that had brought him to this moment, and he made a decision. The next morning, Richard called Marcus. The conversation was brief. He asked if Marcus would come to the store again, alone, if possible, just to talk. Marcus was hesitant, but something in Richard's voice, an urgency mixed with gentleness, made him agree. When Marcus arrived, the store was closed. Richard was waiting. They went to his office, a space filled with books and photographs and the quiet weight of years. Richard told Marcus everything. About Daniel, about the stairwell, about the woman with kind eyes who refused to walk away, about Diane. Marcus sat in silence as the story unfolded. He had not known. Diane never told him. She came home late that night, worried about the money she had lost, but she said nothing about saving a life, because that was who she was. To her, kindness was not something to boast about. It was simply how you lived. Richard's voice cracked as he spoke. Your wife gave me back my son, he said. She gave him a second chance. And I never got to thank her. I never got to tell her what she meant to us. And then yesterday, I watched my employees treat you like you were nothing, like you did not matter. I cannot undo that, but I can honor her memory. I can make sure her family never struggles the way she did. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a check. Marcus looked at the amount, and his breath stopped. It was more money than he had earned in 5 years of working himself to exhaustion. I don't want charity, Marcus said, his voice shaking. This is not charity, Richard said firmly. This is a debt. Your wife saved my son. She gave him life. Let me give you and Isaiah a future. Let me honor what she did by making sure you never have to choose between dignity and survival again. Marcus stared at the check, at the man offering it, and he understood that this was about more than money. It was about connection, about the way one act of kindness could echo through time, changing lives in ways no one could foresee. It was about Diane, whose compassion had planted a seed that was now blooming into something beautiful. It was about Isaiah, who deserved to grow up knowing his mother's love had mattered. And it was about Richard, who was learning that redemption is not found in wealth, but in what we choose to do with the power. Hold, die. Marcus took the check, not because he needed it, though he did, but because refusing it would dishonor Diane's memory. Thank you, he whispered. No, Richard said. Thank you. Thank her, Pen. Over the following weeks, Richard made changes that went beyond one family. He implemented training programs for all employees on bias and dignity, and the practice of seeing people rather than assumptions. He created a scholarship fund in Diane's name to help single parents pursue education while raising children. He established a community fund providing interest-free loans to families who needed help affording the things that brought joy and built memories. And he made certain that every person who entered Sterling and Hayes, regardless of what they wore or where they came from, was treated with the respect they deserved. Word of what happened spread. Some people praised it. Others called it performative. But for those who had experienced similar humiliations, for those who had been judged by their appearance and made to feel invisible, it mattered. It was proof that change was possible. That one voice speaking up could shift the world, even if only slightly, even if only for one moment. Isaiah wore his lion pendant every day. It became more than jewelry. It became a symbol of his father's love, his mother's legacy, the stranger who saw their humanity when others saw only surface. As Isaiah grew, he carried those lessons forward. He remembered the day his father walked into a store that did not want him and walked out with his dignity intact. He remembered the man who knelt down and told him lions protect their families. And he became the kind of person who stood up for those who could not stand up for themselves, who noticed the invisible, who loved without condition, just like his mother, Homo, just like his father. If you let this story sit with you for a moment, if you allow it to settle into your chest and take root there, you will feel the truth of it, not just in your mind but in your heart. Because this is not just Marcus's story. It is the story of every person who has been judged by appearance rather than character, dismissed by circumstance rather than seen for who they truly are. It's the story of every parent who has sacrificed everything to give their child one moment of happiness. Every person who has walked into a space and felt the eyes on them, the suspicion, the unspoken message that they do not belong. And it is the story of everyone who has had the power to choose between cruelty and compassion, between convenience and courage, and made the choice that changed a life. We live in a world that teaches us to judge quickly, to make assumptions based on clothing and skin color and zip codes and accents. We build walls between ourselves and others, convincing ourselves those walls keep us safe, keep us superior, keep us comfortable in our little corners of the world. But those walls do not protect us. They imprison us. They rob us of connection, of empathy, of the chance to see the profound beauty in people we might otherwise dismiss as unworthy of our attention. Marcus walked into that store carrying dignity that no one could take from him. Not the employees who tried to force him out. Not the customers who watched in silence. Not the world that had spent 45 years trying to convince him he was less than human. Because dignity is not granted by others. It cannot be given or taken away. It is something you choose to carry within yourself even when everything around you says you have no right to it. But there is another lesson here, one that Richard Hayes learned through pain and regret and the ghost of a woman he should have loved better. That power comes with responsibility. That if you have the ability to change someone's life, to correct an injustice, to speak up when others remain silent, and you choose not to act, you become complicit in the cruelty. You become part of the system that crushes rather than lifts, that judges rather than understands. Richard could have sided with his employees. He could have protected his store's reputation, avoided the discomfort of confronting his own failures. But he chose to see, to listen, to act, and in doing so, he honored not just Marcus and Isaiah, but his own dormant humanity. Think about Diane, a woman who spent her life invisible to most of the world, who scrubbed floors and cleaned toilets and wore herself down to nothing providing for her family, who could have walked past a dying stranger and told herself it was not her responsibility. But she stopped. She stayed. She held the hand of someone she did not know and told him he was going to be okay. And in that moment of pure compassion, with no witnesses and no reward, she changed the course of multiple lives. She saved Daniel. She gave Richard back his son. She planted seeds of change that would bloom years after her death. This is the heart of every moral truth. That we are not separate, that our lives are woven together in ways we cannot always see, that the smallest act of kindness can ripple forward through time, touching people we will never meet, changing futures we will never witness. So what do we take from this? What is the lesson that echoes beyond marble floors and velvet boxes, beyond one father and one son, and one moment of injustice corrected? It is this: never judge another human being by their appearance. Never assume you know their story based on what you see on the surface. The person in worn clothes might be a parent who has given everything for their child. The person cleaning your office might be the one who saves a life. The person you dismiss today might be the one whose kindness reshapes your tomorrow. And if you have power, any power at all, use it for good. If you witness injustice, speak. If you see cruelty, intervene. Because silence is agreement. Inaction is complicity. And the world changes not through grand gestures alone, but through the accumulation of small choices made by ordinary people who decide that compassion matters more than comfort, that dignity is more valuable than status, that love is always, always stronger than hate. Marcus taught Isaiah that strength is not about rage or violence. It is about grace under pressure, about protecting your heart from bitterness, even when the world gives you every reason to be bitter, about standing tall even when everything around you is designed to bring you to your knees. Richard taught everyone who heard this story that respect is not reserved for those who can afford it, that every human being, regardless of wealth or status or anything else, deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with basic human decency. And Diane, who never lived to see the full impact of her kindness, taught all of us that the most powerful thing we can do in this brief existence is simply to care, to notice the person in pain, to offer help when it is not required or expected, to be light in someone's darkness, even when no one is watching, even when there is no applause or recognition. These are the truths that transcend time and place and circumstance. These are the lessons that matter when everything else falls away. And if this story has touched something in you, if you felt the ache of Marcus's humiliation, or the warmth of Richard's redemption, or the quiet power of Diane's compassion, then let it change you. Let it remind you to look twice before judging, to think before speaking, to choose kindness even when it costs you something, to stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. Because every person you pass on the street is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Every face you see carries a story, a sorrow, a dream, a hope that is as real and important as your own. And how you treat them in those brief moments of intersection can be the difference between despair and dignity, between isolation and connection, between a world that tears itself apart and a world that holds together. This is not just one story. This is our story, the story of what it means to be human, the story of what we can become when we choose compassion over judgment, when we value character over appearance, when we recognize that every life has worth regardless of what the world says about it. If you believe in that story, if you want to be part of creating a world where kindness matters and dignity is universal, then share this. Let it reach one more person who needs to hear it. Let it be a spark that lights one more heart. Because every story hides a truth, and every truth deserves to be heard.